Hello, 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 and welcome to this edition of the Jolly Heretic. No comedy skit today because I want to get straight to the point, which is about the work of Mr. Graham Hancock and his ancient civilization hypothesis, which you may particularly have heard about if you have watched the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. And this is the idea that there was a great civilization at the end of the last ice age, and that this civilization was responsible perhaps for building the pyramids and the Sphinx and Göbekli Tepe and all kinds of other ancient monuments. Now, one of the pieces of evidence that this is based on is Plato's recollection in two of his dialogues that there was such an ancient civilization about 12,000 years ago. And that is the only written evidence in any ancient sources, by the way, for the existence of, Atlantis, essentially. And it occurred to me, has nobody looked at the ancient Greek? Has nobody looked into the nature of the ancient Greek and what can be inferred from the subtleties of the ancient Greek? Because they should have done, and I, as a person that did a theology degree, in particular was aware of this, that we were taught that we can kind of tell from subtleties of the Greek if something is to be taken literally or not, or if something is you can infer that information from subtleties of the Greek. So I've been corresponding with experts on Greek, and I wanted to tell you about my conclusions. But first of all, let's look at what it said. So basically the idea is that Plato set out the story of Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. The latter, by the way, ends abruptly because he didn't finish it. Most scholars are of the view that this was invented, and it was a way of portraying the ideal state. And it should be emphasised, by the way, that he talks about there being a war between Atlantis and ancient Athens, but from the archaeological evidence, Athens definitely didn't exist until about 3000 BC, so way after the end of the Ice Age. But even so, perhaps there was some original Athens that was completely destroyed. Now, in Timaeus, Socrates and his companions are discussing the features of the ideal state. And, of course, Plato's dialogues recall conversations that Socrates had, but they also use Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. And it's that is true of the later dialogues, and we're dealing with the later dialogues here. So Socrates asks his companions to tell a story that will illustrate the key features of the ideal state, with the implication that any such story will be made up, right? Will be a parable. Now, despite this, Critias decides to tell them a story based on, he says, historical facts. And this will be an account of an extremely ancient conflict over 9,000 years earlier between ancient Athens and a maritime empire known as Atlantis. And in this conflict, ancient Athens defeated the great Atlantis before the entire island of Atlantis, which is somewhere out to the west, was submerged by floods and earthquakes and whatever. This story, he says, was originally told to the 6th century BC statesman Solon, and it has been passed down in Critias' own family for many generations. Now, Critias explains that knowledge of this Athenian ancient conflict has been lost in Greece due to natural disasters. However, it was preserved in Egypt because perhaps, I don't know, the late Bronze Age collapse or whatever did not impact Egypt as badly as it did Greece. In Greece, all the cities were wiped out, but in Egypt, the cities still kind of carried on. Now, the information was preserved by Egyptian priests, and it was one such Egyptian priest who told Solon the story of Atlantis when Solon was visiting Egypt. In those days, it was a relatively high civilization, so of course you have international travel and things like this. Now, this story had been recorded in ancient texts, he says, which were presumably continuously copied out in order to be preserved. Now, even in the ancient world, there was debate over whether or not Atlantis was literally true, and people have suggested that it was actually referring to the Minoan collapse or whatever. But anyway, in terms of taking Plato literally, there is evidence, and Hancock presents this, that there was a major flood at the exact point indicated in the dialogue, i.e. 12,000 years ago. Climatic records tell us that there would have been such a flood, with some evidence that climatic fluctuation was caused by maybe a comet or by the impact of multiple comets. And Graham Hancock looks at this, though others dispute the comet hypothesis. And numerous cultures do recall an extreme flood, though whether this is the same flood is unclear. And of course, it would be an astonishing coincidence for Plato to make up a fable and get the year of the flood exactly correct to such a degree of precision. Although, of course, weird coincidences can happen. Moreover, the priest told Solon about how civilization is intermittently wiped out by natural disasters, with civilization having to begin almost from scratch each time. He says, just as you have been equipped at any one time with writing and the other requirements of urban life, then again, after the usual number of years, the flood from heaven comes like a plague, borne down upon you, and spares only those among you who are lacking in literacy and culture, so that you become children, as it were, all over again, knowing nothing of what happened in ancient times, either here or in your own region. And we also know that this idea is explored in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, by the way, and Hancock looks at this. So even putting this aside, it could be argued that you have multiple attestation in that the Egyptian priests did keep these kinds of records to which Solon refers. The Temple of Sais, which Solon visited, had been destroyed in 1400 BC. However, the Temple at Edfu, which still stands, the priests carved some of these sacred texts onto the walls. And the text dated very far beyond the construction of the temple, which was in 237 BC, so they're preserved on the walls even today. They talk about an island of Ka, which was the home to the primeval ones, or the gods, and the land was flooded by a serpent, or a great leaping one, which could imply that the flood was caused by, I don't know, some kind of comet or whatever, and that the gods were left behind in these primeval lands, and so the gods left the primeval lands in order to refound civilization, the resurrection of the former world, the resurrection of the destroyed world in the new land. And these gods had special powers and talents. Alongside them were, according to Hancock, the 7 sages, and that they wanted to rebuild civilization. And there's also something called the Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, a papyrus, which dates to 2000 BC. Again, it discusses an island of Ka, although there are fantastical elements, the idea that the island is ruled by serpents, things like this. But in this sense, you have a certain degree of evidence that this is correct. Now, this all seems convincing until you look at the alternative arguments, and in particular, you go back to the original ancient Greek. On the face of it, Critias is telling the literal truth, and he says this. He is recounting facts preserved in his family record, so, you know, by the criteria of multiple attestation, we should believe him. But on closer examination, the presentation of his story, the idea that it's literally true, becomes rather less plausible. For instance, it's very unlikely that a set of events so important in the history of Athens would have remained entirely unknown, though known only to Critias and his family, for numerous generations. It's an amazing coincidence that Critias produces this incredibly suitable history just out of the blue, in response to Socrates' request for a fictional narrative on what we might call the ideal state in action. It's also very suspicious that the allegedly fake story, is so reminiscent of an actual, real-world, very well-known set of historical events that they knew about at the time, which is Athens' defeat of Persia at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Although neither Critias or the listeners comment on this obvious similarity. But it does look, despite what Critias is saying, as if the story is, in fact, basically the projection of the war between Athens and Persia back into primeval time. Another indication of the implausibility of the story is Socrates' statement, which shows that he shows little interest in the alleged historical status of the story. He says, to quote him, Socrates says, "The fact that it is not a made-up story, but a true account, is all important, I suppose." The Greek is po, I suppose, or perhaps. And according to classicists with whom I've corresponded, this implies scepticism or just lack of interest. Now, why would he be sceptical or disinterested or uninterested in this idea that it was real? Well, perhaps he's basically being sarcastic. Perhaps he knows perfectly well that this guy is talking nonsense and that obviously he's projecting things back into the past. Now, a Norwegian philosopher called Thomas Kjeller Johansen has also set out his criticisms of this case. He says that in the text, Socrates is asked to be entertained in return for the entertainment which he had provided his followers the previous day. He alludes to an earlier Platonic text, the Republic, and discusses the idea of the ideal state, which he says should not be dismissed as fictional, even though its existence cannot be proven. Now, Socrates, it should be said, he conceives of two kinds of truth. There's the literal historical truth, and stories that contain, and then there's, stories that contain the nature of reality about the gods or whatever. The latter is called mythos. Now, Socrates' notion of the ideal city and how its citizens behave, this is mythos. Yeah, this is a story that contains eternal truths, if you like, rather than a literal historical truth. Now, Critias explains that he is retelling Socrates' mythos as a true historical account, and he compares it to the way that the Egyptians would retell Greek mythos about gods burning the ground with their chariots or whatever as meteorite attacks or volcanic eruptions. But Critias then proceeds to explain that he will, in fact, transfer Socrates' mythos to his extremely ancient Athens, and he uses this word hos. And hos translates as something like as if. So Critias is saying that basically we will posit that these hypothetical ancient people have Athenian citizenship and that they have been given Athenian citizenship for the purposes of this story. And so according to this, our Norwegian scholar, the Greek is very carefully constructed in order to imply that the story is not literally historically true. And this is done in a context in which it was very common to discuss an idealised history or other idealised concepts kind of through the lens of Athens and through the lens of a sort of hypothetical Athens. So in other words, I mean, I can't really think of a particularly good comparison, but it's a bit like if we were discussing modern day English ideas through the lens of Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood and his Merry Men. Well, that doesn't mean that there was necessarily a the Robin Hood and his Merry Men were real. It's just a method that we use to discuss ideas. And the other thing is that although Critias initially says that it's literally true and so forth, he also admits, he says that the ancient Egyptians have a love of money over truth, and that means that compared to the ancient Greeks, they are deceitful and can't be trusted. And he also argues that an account can be trusted because it has been written down. But as far as the Greeks were concerned, written history began about 1,000 years after Atlantis. So that means that he is himself admitting that there was 1,000 years when this was just hearsay and not written down. And so effectively, he is admitting that it's not true. It's not literally true. And so this is at least one counter-argument to the Graham-Hancock hypothesis, the idea that we should take Plato at his word with regard to the existence of Atlantis and Athens 12,000 years ago. If you consult the ancient Greek, according to these experts, no, the subtleties of the ancient Greek imply that Athens is not, or that Atlantis is simply not meant to be taken literally.
Hello, hello, hello! The Jolly Heretic is an online public house which meets on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. New York, in which we discuss the kind of based, fearless science which is increasingly expunged from our woke, joke universities. If you would like to help the Jolly Heretic public house, and there are many ways you can do so, please, please, please become one of my patrons on Subscribestar. Also, if you want to, you can donate to the channel using Odyssey and Entropy, and you can also purchase Jolly Heretic merchandise, such as shirts and mugs. All of the links are in the description. Again, I'd be most violently grateful if you could assist the Jolly Heretic Public House, and I will see you all soon, and goodbye!